By the end of the Third Age, many of the men in the Westlands of Middle-earth were lucky to live in the kingdoms of Gondor, Rohan, or even Dale, having powerful armies and fortresses that could protect them. But not all men had this luxury. Some lived in small homesteads or communities, having little to protect them but their own weapons and valor. Despite these challenges, these men survived for thousands of years and sometimes even thrived. In this video, we talk about the Woodmen, the hardest men in Middle-earth. Before I start the video, I do want to say that this video is about the Woodmen of Northman origin who dwelt in Rhovanion. The reason I'm saying this is because there were technically another group of Woodmen that dwelt in Beleriand during the First Age. These men were of the House of Halef and dwelt in the Forest of Brethil or in the lands near it beyond the River Teiglin. While they were referred to as Woodmen in the tales relating to them, this video is not about them, and if I were to do a video about them, it would just be about the House of Halef and their offshoots. Anyway, back to our Woodmen. The Woodmen's origins can be traced right back to the First Age. As the three houses of men trekked westwards across Middle-earth, groups would split off and end up settling in the lands that would be known as Eriador, Rhovanion, and even Gondor, to the point of where those who ended up making it to Beleriand would be a minority of those peoples. In the case of the Woodmen, their ancestors were related to the House of Hador, and would end up settling in the wide lands between the Sea of Rhûn and the Misty Mountains. Collectively, these people and their descendants would be known as the Northmen. Because they were related to the House of Hador, they would have spoken a language that was very similar to Taliskar, the ancestor of Adunaic. Although their two languages weren't quite mutually intelligible, they would have had a lot of similar words, and when Westron eventually formed from a vulgar tongue of Adunaic in the late Second Age, the Woodmen would have found it easier to pick up. If you want to look into the types of names they had, I would say look no further than Dwarven names, because they were taken from the Northman tongue. You could also look at names like Bard, Bjorn, Bran, Bane, Bort. That last one is from The Simpsons, but basically anything that starts with a B. These Northmen were numerous, but they weren't really advanced in any way. They did not build cities or form kingdoms, they did not write, and their ability to craft was mostly limited to wood. They did have their uses though, especially to the dwarves, because the Northmen practiced agriculture and animal husbandry, which the dwarves avoided doing. Also, despite their technological shortcomings, the Northmen were valiant, grew in numbers faster than the dwarves, and were excellent scouts for them owing to their use of horses. So an alliance formed, the alliance of the Northmen and the dwarves. The Northmen acted as soldiers and scouts for the dwarves and provided them with food, and in return, the dwarves crafted weapons for the men, built roads for them, and taught them how to use stone and steel. This alliance prospered throughout the First and Second Age, defending against Morgoth's orcs that originally came east as raiders, and eventually came east as a migration following Morgoth's defeat. Unfortunately, like all good things in Middle-earth, the alliance came to a fiery end. In the middle of the Second Age, Sauron attacked Eriador in what was the War of the Elves and Sauron, but a lesser-known part of the war occurred in Rhovanion. Easterlings, allied to Sauron, invaded those lands in great numbers. The dwarves were occupied in the west and could not help their Northmen allies. The Northmen, while numerous, lived in small scattered communities and were completely annihilated. Some of them did survive, mostly living impoverished lives in the woods of Greenwood or in the caves and foothills of the Misty Mountains. As the Second Age progressed, these survivors started forming distinct groups. Those to the east of Greenwood became more warlike and coalesced into greater communities, eventually becoming the Men of Rhovanion and later the Men of Dale. Some seemingly stayed in the Misty Mountains for a long time, eventually becoming a group known as the Beornings, notable because they could shapeshift. But in the Vales of Anduin and in Greenwood, the men remained in small communities, and these men would come to be known as the Woodmen. As a side note, there is a little bit of confusion about who actually belongs to the Woodmen group. Tolkien occasionally uses the term Men of the Vales of Anduin, which I've shortened to Valemen in the past. It's not clear whether the terms are interchangeable or whether the Woodmen are simply a subgroup of the Men of the Vales of Anduin, or even an entirely different group. Based on what I can figure out, the Valemen are also Woodmen, but are slightly different from the Woodmen who dwell in Greenwood, in the sense that the Woodmen of the Vales of Anduin interacted with other groups far more, and seemingly formed larger communities. By the end of the Second Age, the Woodmen were at least on friendly terms with the Wood Elves of Greenwood. They were friendly to the last alliance, but seemingly didn't put together a force that would join it. They would, however, put together a force during the tragedy that was the disaster at the Gladden Fields, where Isildur's company was ambushed by orcs from the Misty Mountains. Catching wind of the battle, the Woodmen sent runners to Thranduil, while they themselves hurried to Isildur's aid. Unfortunately, they arrived too late to save the company, but they did scatter the orcs and prevent them from desecrating the bodies of the fallen. Their arrival also saved the life of Prince Elendur's wounded squire, Skjoldmø, the only one who could give a first-hand account of most of the battle. During Gondor's Golden Age, the Woodmen prospered and even acknowledged the authority of the Gondorian kings, although they didn't truly serve as vassals. At this time, they dwelt from the southern edge of Greenwood, possibly even to the lands beyond the Carrock. They also dwelt throughout Greenwood from the Old Forest Road to the bottom edge of the Narrows of the Forest. Yet even during these years, a shadow was being cast over their lands. The necromancer, Sauron, took up his abode at the old elvish hill of Amon Lank in the south of Greenwood, and it became known as Dol Guldur. Thanks to this, the forest was given a new name, Mirkwood. I think it's often understated how terrible Mirkwood was. We see it during the quest for Erebor, and that was one of the safer parts of the forest, further from the corruption. Even then, very little light penetrates the canopy, the air feels stuffy, there is no wind, it's hard to make progress, there's barriers such as the evil enchanted stream which puts people to sleep, and it's easy to become lost if you venture from the path. It becomes infested by large insects and bats, and then even more dangerous monsters such as giant spiders. And of course, there's Sauron's servants such as orcs and wargs. Despite this, the Woodmen did not abandon Mirkwood. Things also took a turn for the worse outside the forest. For years, the Might of Gondor and the Northman Kingdom of Rhovanion had kept the Woodmen safe from invaders from the east. This changed in 1856. The Battle of the Plains saw the Kingdom of Rhovanion destroyed at the hands of the Wainrider Easterlings, and Gondor withdrew behind the Anduin. Many of the Northman refugees from Rhovanion actually fled through the forest, eventually settling in the lands between the Old Ford and the Gladden Fields. Although this swelled the power of the men who lived there, it meant that the Wainriders were now free to raid up the Vales of Anduin from the Brownlands. The Wainrider threat was defeated in 1944, but Rhovanion was not restored. In the central Vales of Anduin, there was actually the problem of overpopulation, because these lands were already well populated when the refugees from Rhovanion arrived. This problem was solved in 1977. The Northman refugees, the Aethiod, went north and drove out the remaining men of Angmar from their lands. These lands in the upper Vales of Anduin were flatter and wider and better suited for their lifestyle of raising horses. Presumably, some of the Woodmen mixed with them and ended up accompanying them. This solved one problem, but of course another problem was not far behind. Shortly after the Aethiod left, the dwarves were forced to abandon Moria due to the Balrog. The problem with this is that Khazad-dûm was a major obstacle to the orcs of the Misty Mountains, who had occupied Gundabad many years earlier and had been causing havoc within the mountains ever since. Fortunately, the can was kicked down the road. Sauron's abandonment of Dol Guldur in 2063 led to the start of the Watchful Peace, a near 400-year-long period where Sauron's servants were mostly inactive. While Mirkwood was no doubt still dangerous, it was probably a little safer during this time. But when Sauron returned in 2460, all of these problems came rushing back. The orcs in the mountains started spreading rapidly, occupying Moria, and they began to raid down into the Vales of Anduin. Even worse, a new threat emerged from the east. These were the Balkoff Easterlings, descendants of the Wainriders. They began amassing in the lands of Old Rhovanion, and during this time they raided through Mirkwood and up into the southern Vales of Anduin. The raiding was so bad that the Woodmen ended up abandoning the Vales of Anduin south of the Gladden Fields. While the Balkoff were defeated, the Aethiod left their northern homes to establish Rohan. Without a powerful bulwark to the north, the Woodmen were now pressed into an even smaller bubble. They now only occupied the western eaves of Mirkwood and the Vales of Anduin between the Gladden Fields in the south and the Old Ford in the north. During these years, it's possible that the ancestors of the Beornings arrived in the Vales of Anduin. They were suspected to have originally been from the Misty Mountains, but had been driven forth by the multiplying orcs. They were a men related to and not too dissimilar to the Woodmen, except for the fact that they were skin changers and could transform into huge bears. As usual, the Woodmen managed to weather the storm from both Mirkwood and the Misty Mountains, and they were eventually rewarded for their perseverance. The War of the Dwarves and Orcs between 2793 and 2799 saw the Orcs of the Misty Mountains almost entirely obliterated, severely reducing the danger from the mountains. In the years that followed, the Woodmen went on the offensive, and by the time of The Hobbit, we're told that many of the bolder ones were in the process of marching north, reclaiming lost territory near to the Old Ford. We actually get some insight into what was going on in the Vales of Anduin in The Hobbit. We're told that the Orcs and Wargs, having somewhat recovered from the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, still did not wish to risk an open battle with the Woodmen. They were, however, planning a massive night raid to kill their foes and capture plenty of slaves. Unfortunately for them, their plan was unwittingly foiled when Thorin's company crashed their meeting, resulting in many orcs being killed by fire or by the eagles, and any chance to meaningfully reduce the Woodmen was soon lost when the orcs suffered a devastating defeat during the Battle of the Five Armies. Afterwards, the Woodmen experienced something of a resurgence, and life in the Vales of Anduin was without fear for a while. Many of them united under Beorn, the greatest of the Skin Changers, who had slain the Orc chieftain Bolg at the Battle of the Five Armies. This group became known as the Beornings, although it's unknown how many of them were actually Skin Changers and related to Beorn, and how many of them were simply Woodmen who took him as a chief. I also want to point out that Woodmen and Beornings were not used interchangeably. They were different groups. Thanks to the further decimation of the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, the Beornings took control of the High Pass, holding it open for travellers, for a hefty fee, I might add. Still, there were plenty of dangers that they had to face. Sauron's minions and other evil creatures still roamed Mirkwood, and Sauron's return to Mordor didn't change much in that regard. There was also a new terror that emerged sometime after 2941. A ghost that apparently drank blood and would break into houses to steal babies and young children to eat them. Unknown to the Woodmen, this ghost was none other than Gollum, who had forsaken his mountain cave to search for the One Ring. Just before the War of the Ring, Aragorn captured Gollum, and it was the Beornings who helped Aragorn get him to Thranduil's elves. One final test would come to the Woodmen and the Beornings, now led by Grimbeorn, the son of Beorn, in the War of the Ring. While we know Sauron's forces were highly active in the north, we actually aren't told much about how the Woodmen and the Beornings fared. Our little glimpse into what was going on actually comes when Frodo sits on the Seat of Seeing at Amon Hen. Looking north, he can see that orcs were spilling out of the Misty Mountains, and that the lands of the Beornings were aflame, heavily implying that there was heavy fighting between the two groups. Under Mirkwood, he could also see that elves and men were battling fell creatures beneath the trees, proving that the Woodmen were also not spared from the conflict. But in the end, the Woodmen survived yet again. While we don't know how many losses they sustained, we do know that they were thought about when the map of the North was redrawn, when Thranduil and Celeborn met under the trees of Mirkwood after the destruction of Dol Guldur. They partitioned the forest between themselves and the Woodmen and the Beornings. The Woodmen and the Beornings would receive the large section of Mirkwood, now known as Erin Lasgallen, the Wood of Green Leaves, between the mountains of Mirkwood and the narrows of the forest. We don't know what happens to the Woodmen during the Fourth Age. Presumably it went fairly well. Although not without effort, Mirkwood would still have to be cleansed of giant spiders and other evil creatures, and the Misty Mountains would be home to orcs, although diminished, for many years to come. But under the protection of the reunited kingdom, we can assume that with relative peace and with new wide lands to expand through, the Woodmen and the Beornings ended up prospering in a way that they hadn't since the First Age, or perhaps ever. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I apologise about the title, the opportunity was there and it fit, so how could I not make it that? Also, it's eye-catching. Well, at least I hope it is. I wonder if it will snare a few people who know very little about Middle-earth and will go into the video thinking it will be about something completely different. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, I'm actually not sorry about the title at all.